I would like to ask the participants of the panel to join us. Kerstin Kohlenberg, she's a journalist and author, was head of the Washington bureau of Die ZEIT from 2014 to 2021. And since her return to Berlin, she has been a reporter and primarily writes features and essays on the US for Die ZEIT. Welcome, Kerstin Kohlenberg. Jan Zielonka, long-term friend and partner. He's professor of politics and international relations at the University of Venice and Emeritus professor and fellow at St. Antony's College in Oxford. And one of the, say, really leading political intellectuals of our time. Thanks for being here, Jan. And of course, last not least, Karolina Wigura. You got to know her already in our opening. Beyond being the head of our liberal democracy program at LibMod and senior fellow, together with her husband, Jaroslav Kuis. She is associate professor at the Warsaw University and a member of the board at Kultura Liberalna Foundation. Karolina. And of course, Alan Kahan, I don't need to introduce you once more. In this universe of ideas and arguments you provided in your keynote, I would like to focus on the topic you started with, populism and liberalism. What are the shortcomings and flaws of liberalism and liberal democracies which enabled the rise of populism? And what should be liberal answers and responses to it? This, I would suggest, should be the guiding questions of our conversation. But I would first like to invite all of our panelists to respond. Yeah, what are your first impressions, reactions to what we have heard from Alan? Would you like to start, Jan?
Sure. Thank you, Alan. Now it's working. Now. Well, I knew you as a wonderful writer. Today I had the chance to see that you are a wonderful speaker too. But when I listen to you, I think about a caricature of my friend from Poland, Mleczko. There is Moses preaching to the crowd with the 10 Commandments, and two people in the back say, it's a good program, but not very realistic. And I think fathers of the church realize this. And they made it clear. There is hope, but there is also fear. There is the hell. And, you know, I live in Tuscany for 40 years, so I know Dante Alighieri. And you read Dante Alighieri or go to Duomo when in the couple there is painting of a hell, you realize there is no kidding, right? And the church, of course, withdraw somehow. They don't talk today so much about the hell, and maybe this will explain the crisis of liberalism, if I follow you. But the problem is more important here. The problem is that, that all people in the positions of authority telling you what you should do in the ethical realm, you know, assume a role of those in the church who argue the case. And if they act according to their preaching, yes. But in life, as you know, things are more complicated. Because the parents teach the children to be faithful to your wife, or husband, but they don't practice it, yeah? Those in the government tell you you shouldn't steal public money, and they sometimes do this. And the whole telling that we should lead by example, apply our ethical norms to ourselves, not to others, is easier to say than done. Easier said than done. So in this sense, of course, you know, the examples you mentioned, difficult to quarrel, right? The egalitarian argument, also the ecological argument, I think at least most of us with those have no problems. But of course, it never stops there. And unless you indicate where are the limits, we run into the trouble. And the limits in politics are decided, and I finish here, by political process, by democracy, about which you talk little, because you believe that this institutional engineering cannot do wonders. I agree with a lot of these things, but I would like to say that because you cite cas mude so much when you define, you know, populism, and I believe cas mude is really the person who understood it best and studied it for many years, you don't really come to his conclusions. Because conclusions of Cas is that populism thrives on pathologies of democracy. Democracy, not ethical weakness of liberals. He says pathologies of democracy, because populism, he says, like you did, existed for many years, but there was no demand for populism because people were more or less happy with the way democracy works. It is only now, and Ralf cited statistics, that people, majority of people, are not happy with democracy it works. And therefore, Kass says, rightly, that populism is a liberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. So unless we address, and we can discuss how, the problems of democracy we live in today, we practice today, we cannot really sort out the ethical questions in politics, which is not the authority of a preacher, but which is kind of negotiated general will, that there are things we want to, kind of society we want to have. And here, I think you are right about institutional engineering and the limits of this. But what I try to understand myself is whether democracy is really fit for the digital era we live in, which totally reorganized the issues of time and space, because democracy is rooted to nation state. There is hardly democracy, you know, on transnational level, while most of the issues are either local or transnational, and because democracy is a prisoner of the voters of today. So, you know, politicians like to make children featured on the electoral campaigns, but when it comes to tough votes, they always vote for people like ourselves, you know, because we have more votes than than the younger generations, and particularly those who have no votes yet. So we are constrained in terms of time and space. The digitalization has totally reorganized the political universe, and democracy, business adjusted, mafia adjusted, and democracy hasn't. And this is, in my view, the problem, but I will leave to other colleagues to have other views on that.
Thanks a lot. Frau Kohlenberg.
Well, I'm a journalist, so I come more from the base, I guess, when I look at issues like that. And to me, it seems that liberalism is a framing of for politics that actually still has options and chance to be defined. Democracy, on the other hand, for a lot of people that I've encountered in the US or in Germany, is already defined as a value of the left, or it is moving there. And I feel that we are right now in the state that people start, I don't know, it's probably not a majority, I don't know what the concrete last numbers are, but that democracy is being seen as something, as a threat to people that feel that the values that democratic politicians or that they encounter are all the values that they feel are a threat to their lives. And to me, liberalism is a category that is a bit freer because it is not so defined in terms of, liberal democracy is equality, and it is freedom, and it's ecological rights, and it's human rights, and it's, the framework that democratic societies gave themselves after the Second World War. Liberalism, to me, and to the people that I talk to as a reporter, is a bit more, has a bit more freedom of being redefined. And what I see as the big opportunity, hope maybe, is that it can hopefully maybe define the space in between what populists see as liberal democracy and liberal Democrats see as right-wing populism. And it can open up this space in terms of what is patriotism, or, maybe reclaim the debate about nationalism. What is a good way of talking about who I am as a citizen of a country without excluding or without using populist talking points to define myself, without fear of the other to define myself as me. Ali Hochschild, sociology in America, she already tried to figure out how to bridge the gap between ecology, what right-wing politicians see in it and left-wing politicians see in it. And she marked some similarities. And I think liberalism can be a tool to define those spaces that are, and it's basically, I would define that as sort of a new idea of a middle ground between values that we see are, flying into two different directions. And it's maybe the glue that might, bring them a bit together via, a different kind of personnel, a different kind of background, different narratives that we have to produce.
Vielen Dank. Karolina.
Thank you. So I have been listening to Alan with great pleasure, like always, and I was thinking that we are all so much preoccupied with health nowadays, and so we ask about the health of liberalism. And so I was searching for an author that would be a good medicine doctor for political affairs, and I found Machiavelli. So he writes, remember what the doctors tell you about tuberculosis. In its early stages, it's easy to cure and hard to diagnose. But if you don't spot it and treat it, as time goes by, it gets easy to diagnose and hard to cure. And then he adds, and so it is with the affairs of the state. And we might add, and so it is with populism. It's already there, it's very big, and how to cure it. And I really love the fact that Alan comes back to liberalism, and basically you say, before we even try to heal anything here, let's just try to make liberalism healthy. And I also extremely admire the fact that you point out that we really lack new ideas. We have been observing this during the so-called wave of populism in the past 10 to 20 years, right? It is going in circles. We either disregard populism or we overestimate populism, and we are going round and round in circles. And some examples of that might be, even though populism has been a global phenomenon for some time now, we still heard a lot of arguments like, oh, this is a post-communist problem. Those homo sovieticuses simply do not know how to do liberal democracy. Or, oh, those populists, they are simply fascists and Nazis. It's the repeat of what we had in the 30s. Or, populism will actually make democracy great again. It will actually bring a revival. So it's those cliches that actually are repeated, and then they do not allow us to go further. And then I think what you propose with democratic liberalism is a really new opening. Now, why? First, you write about freedom from fear, but actually in your proposal, you meet what Jan was talking about, hope. It is a very hopeful proposal. And I do believe, I was talking about being cautious as a liberal. I think we should be cautiously hopeful as liberals. So I would be very much against what George Orwell called once catastrophic gradualism. So the idea that actually we have to have calamity after calamity after calamity, etc., etc. No, we actually can cautiously do something right. And I like the notion of democratic liberalism because it reverts a certain idea that I always despised in liberalism. Namely, there is something in liberal democracy, in this idea of liberal democracy, which is like saying to the people, well, behave yourself. Behave yourself because we, the liberals, will offer you a school of how to behave. Whereas the idea of democratic liberalism is the idea to say, well, we'll start to behave ourselves first, and then we'll see. And I very much like this, because it meets very much what I was talking about in the morning, so that liberalism is a promise, and it's also a devotion to moral ideas. And also, what I think is extremely important, I mentioned that it's a garden, but I would say more. It's a garden not only of weak plants, so the personification of freedom and dignity, but it's also the skeleton of the Western culture. This is what liberalism really is. And so this revival of liberalism as a democratic doctrine, I deeply admire that, and I think it's extremely fruitful.
Thanks a lot. Alan, before you respond to these comments, and of course you are free to do so, I would like to give you two questions, maybe to sharpen a little bit our discussion. I will start with what I see as a slight contradiction in your own argument. Yeah, you made a very passionate argument that liberalism has to rediscover its moral roots. And even more, you said that liberalism or liberals need an idea of moral perfection, the good life, and human greatness. But at the same time, the basic definition you gave of liberalism is a negative one. A society in which nobody has to be afraid. The absence of fear, the freedom from fear, which I would agree, this is the fundamental freedom. But you, at the same time, you have been calling for, I would say, a liberal view of how the future should be. And there had been good reasons that liberals, or the majority of liberal thinkers, developed a set of, I would say, values or guiding principles, but never tried to describe the good society or the perfect society. So no liberal utopianism. How do you deal with that?
Yes, we're working. Well, of course, it's not easy to deal with all of these extremely interesting remarks, and I'll do my best to pick a few. And to start with the last one, of course, remember the title of my book is Freedom from Fear, an Incomplete History. My definition, of course, is also incomplete. But freedom from fear is the precondition for developing any positive form of human flourishing. And in making people free from fear, the extension of my argument is liberals have to have ideas of human flourishing, human perfection, etc. in mind. If you take somebody like John Stuart Mill, he has lots of things to say about what he thinks his ideal human being would be like, or at least what a better human being would be like than the ones he sees around him. Not an ideal society, but a path towards making people not just wealthier, but better people. And that, I think, has been what has been missing from the liberalism of recent decades, and what has left our Guardian columnist completely unprepared in her radio show to deal with ethical questions, and she's now recognizing the lack. But it's clearly one of liberalism's great strengths that it is open-ended, that it does not have a strict blueprint for the future. I think this, as has been pointed out, is absolutely why liberalism can rebound from its current travails. That's why we can update the operating system. We've done it in the past, in the face of different fears, different circumstances. There's no reason to think that we can't do it now. There's no guarantee that we will do it now. I'm not that much of an optimist. I'm not yet a Hegelian. But there is hope that we can do it now, that we can, in fact, respond in new ways, which will include trying to bring up buried treasure from a moral and religious liberal past in which nobody imagined that liberalism could be silent about moral issues. It is, I think, hopeless to expect a world in which everyone is a critical thinker. There is no form of education that is going to succeed with that. None ever has, and in my view, none ever will. That's the educational equivalent of the perfect political institution. Not going to happen. But what we can do, if not make everyone a critical thinker, is recognize that there are paths to personal development, character development, improvement as a human being that are in fact open to everyone, or at least to the vast majority. And we have to connect liberalism with that kind of being a better person in the same way that nationalists have managed to draw to themselves idea of improvement as a man, as a patriot, as a fill in the blank, to which we have no counteroffer out there. And we can say that it's only, in fact, through liberalism that you will be able to develop plural ideas, many different ideas of human flourishing that will enable not just, the people in Berlin with advanced degrees, but also the people in Zwickau who've perhaps not quite gotten their Abitur. All these people have souls, and liberals have to offer everything to all these souls. Now, if to be a liberal means to be a saint, forget it, we've lost, right? If to be a parent means to be a person without any moral imperfections for your children to, perceive, well, we should give up parenthood too. That's neither possible nor necessary. We need some liberal saints. We need some liberal heroes. I'm perfectly content with Alexis de Tocqueville for mine. You can all pick your others. But we don't need to be perfect ourselves to preach perfectibility. And last but not least, I want to pick up on the garden metaphor, right? If you're a gardener, you know that weeds grow best in disturbed soil. As Tocqueville put it, freedom will always be a work of art. Despotism grows naturally in democratic societies. We have to continually cultivate the liberal garden. We can't assume that, of course, it's obvious that everything from economic prosperity to moral growth to democracy in the best sense of the word will naturally follow one generation after another in a fundamentally liberal world. The world is not fundamentally illiberal. We have to work to make it liberal. This is indeed a continuous gardening process in which the soil is continually being disturbed by events, in which the weeds are continually growing, and of course, the bigger a weed grows, the harder it is to pull up its roots. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. I have a second question. In your book, you wrote, populism is a democratic reaction against liberal legalism. A democratic reaction. And you had been talking about the democratic nature of populism. I stumbled over this definition because I wonder what remains of democracy if you take away the liberal elements of democracy. Yeah, the division of power, the rule of law, minority rights, political pluralism, and all the liberal, I would say, restrictions of majority democracy, rule of the majority. So would you agree that there is something like illiberal democracy? I would question that. I think illiberal democracy is only the slippery slope to authoritarianism.
Democracy is the sovereignty of the people. What populist challenges that? None. And indeed, from a populist perspective, populists never actually lose an election because, you see, the real people are the people who vote for them. The people who vote against them, whether they're the overeducated, the immigrants, the people of the wrong ethnicity, the people of the wrong sexuality, or the people who are confused about their sexuality, these are not really the people. And so democracy represents the pure, the true people. And democracy and populists never contest the sovereignty of the people. And what's worse, at least in our present world, very large numbers of the people vote for them. This is democratic. It's not liberal, but it is democratic.
Jan, you feel...
I hesitate to say something, you know, after the discussion about gardeners, because my wife always complains I don't do enough in the garden. But when it comes to democracy, democracy is just not only sovereignty of the people. Democracy also checks and balances, minority rights. You know, democracy cannot function if it is winner takes all game. Because democracy requires that the losers accept the results. And if the losers don't accept results because all rights will be taken away from them, you know, democracy cannot function. So democracy is not just sovereignty of the people, and this is exactly what populists try to claim. But here we should simply state very clearly that this is not democracy. This is the impositions of a government of the day, exactly not just procedural, but also ethical code on those who basically lost elections. Abortion story in Poland is a very good example, right? And they just tell to the woman, this is not your choice. This is really the choice of the people. We want elections, and we want to ban abortion under any circumstances. And we can go on with examples of this. So I don't think the sovereignty of the people is the only democratic form. We agree that we cannot have democracy without elections. And the reasons why populists today are important is because they started to win elections. They were always around, but it couldn't, you know, there was not enough demand for them to win elections. Now they win elections, and here I finish, and what the liberals do, instead of trying to address the roots of democratic pathology, they do things which are totally counterproductive. They, for instance, they had three strategies. We should fight populism with populism. I mean, I leave the story, you know, of the idea that liberal populism is contradictions in terms. It's like a liberal democracy. But you know, if a liberal starts to talk and walk like a populist, she or he is a populist. Another strategy they do is technocracy, which is important to solve some technical problems, right? The financial crisis or pandemics. But it is not in the spirit of democracy because it reduces, you know, citizens' participation, deliberation, and basically is not transparent. Or they simply liberals adopt a strategy of fighting populists as such, you know. So they can get rid of this and this party of politicians, but they do not, by fighting populists, cut the demand for populists. So there will be always other kind of populists because, you know, because unless you treat democracy, you will not really cut demand on populism. You can get rid of some populists, but not of the causes of populism. And those strategies we should discuss why we failed. And you can add to this your ethical arguments, but you cannot escape from the kind of dilemmas which actually created discussions which we have today.
Karolina, you feel tempted
to say three things. So one question is to Alan. Having said what I said in the first part of the panel, I would like to ask an and to express my worry. So what has to happen with the patient so that he or she is capable of listening? Why am I asking this? I think that what we observe among many liberal Democrats is that they do not seem to be woken up from their complacency even if they lose the elections. So what has to happen with them? Do they really have to feel the bottom in order to start the democratization of liberalism that you have been talking about? This is somehow near to your first comment, Jan, about Mosse and how this is too optimistic that something like this will happen. But change can occur. The question is about the tipping point, or if you prefer, the beginning of the change. Where does the change begin? So this is point number one. Point number two, I do believe that abortion is a great case, and I'm very happy that it was brought up here for two reasons. First, the populists in Poland lost elections because of what you have been talking about. Abortion was the cause. So it is it was a crucial attack on individual freedom. But at the same time, it's also a great conundrum for liberals as such. Because as I said previously, as liberals, we have to accept freedom of an individual, regardless whether this is a wise decision or a trivial decision. And of course, as liberals, we have to agree, we have to accept that a woman who has very good reasons to undergo an abortion is equal to the one who did it because she didn't have the space for a baby crib at home. Not because she's poor, just because she didn't want to put the baby crib there. But they are equal. And this is this difficulty for liberals. So this is point number two, and I would like very much Alan also to comment on this subject. And then, you know that we have a saying in Poland, if you put two people from Poland, they will have three opinions. So basically, I would like to disagree with Jan. I think it's more difficult that you're saying. It's not that if liberal democratic politicians, or democratic liberal politicians, if you like, use populism, it will not change anything. I think that the Danish way, meaning that the Danish politics has been copying populism for years now in order to spare Denmark a populist government, this is a very effective strategy. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, we can talk about it further, but I do think that there is something to think about here. I like to say that it's a difference, that it is about difference between the populist form and the populist content. You might use a populist form, like Lula, for example, uses a populist form, or Tusk, or Mette Frederiksen. But populist content is something completely different. This is about the authoritarian streak. This is about devastating the rule of law. And this is something that a liberal politician mustn't do. So I think it's more complicated. Thank you.
Before you respond, Ellen,
if I
Frau
may
Kohlenberg.
Maybe there's also a division you have to make between populism and popular publicity of democratic politicians. Because if you choose a popular way of talking, it doesn't have to be a populist way of talking by invoking the other as, you know, somebody you have to fear. And especially coming back to your point about social media and a very new news environment that we're in, it is very difficult, and a lot of people have said that already, to debate complicated issues in this news media. So I think for this new reality of changing values or changing majorities again, Democrats also have to discover or develop a new language of talking about politics themselves, values, and by doing that, sort of countering populist ways of talking, so adjusting to a new public sphere. And one question I have in terms of democratic liberalism, to me that sounds basically liberals weren't democratic in a way that they did not, or that they produced their own, bubble with very high borders. And in order to break those borders down, they have to acknowledge that, some of the values that, more and more in America, a majority already, and in Europe, more and more people demand that they have to be taken seriously, and that's exactly what you said. If abortion rights are a topic again, we have to challenge ourselves with the beliefs that we nurtured for the past, decades, that we are moving in one direction. And liberalism, I guess, it has to acknowledge that we are going sometimes in curves. It's not a one-way street. And this is a moment in time where we are reminded that we have to take a curve, maybe, in terms of where we want to be and what a good life is if we want to stay in a democratic environment where we have as many people together agreeing on things and not by alienating more and more that we did not think we would.
Okay,
please.
Thank you again for some very provocative and insightful comments. And I think a number of them can be brought together under the question of how do you talk to a populist? How do you convince them to vote differently? Part of this is by providing a positive moral vision, but at a very basic level, there's a certain necessary element of respect. You don't have to respect a populist's facts because they usually aren't facts, but that isn't why they adopted them anyway. What you have to respect is not simply populist feelings either, but populist problems. When the Democrats in America insisted for a long time, oh, the economy's doing great, to people who felt that their economy was not doing great. Well, who's going to listen to you? You obviously don't live in my world, in the world of many of us. And you therefore have to both accord respect and demand respect. I too have a moral vision as a liberal. Here's mine. It may be different from yours, but at least we can meet on the common ground of respect as people who are pursuing a vision of what it is to be a good human being. Instead of dismissing people as those whose lives are merely trivial. I indeed may think certain lives are merely trivial. I confess to being an intellectual. But I have to have an attitude of respect for those whose opinions are different. And abortion is actually a great example of this. So, of course, the liberal position is, yes, a woman is free to choose. But far too often, the liberal position has stopped there. Are women infallible in their choices about whether or not to have an abortion? Uniquely infallible? Is there no moral debate to be had whether this is or is not a good choice? Liberals have refused to have that debate, and therefore they have been perceived as people who must be completely amoral because they have no opinions. They say nothing about this obviously terribly important moral decision. All they say is a right to choose, and they say nothing about the choice. I may well in fact, I do wish to support your right to choose, while arguing about what choice you might make in either direction. If not, you appear as someone who has completely abandoned all sense of morality, all sense of religion, and are therefore not just wrong, but in a real sense, subhuman, because amoral, and human beings are not like that. So that's precisely the kind of question that liberals have shied away from again and again, and which liberals need to debate.
Thank you very much. I would like to use the last 15 minutes of our panel to invite you to ask a few questions or very brief comments if you are interested. Alexander is providing a microphone, so please, who wants to raise his voice? Please. And also, I know some of you, please introduce yourself briefly.
Okay, I'm Sabine Döring, Professor of Philosophy at Tübingen University. And of course, I found your talk very intriguing, having myself done a lot of work on John Stuart Mill. I really agree. I mean, I find it fascinating to think of liberalism being in a position to have to reinvent or rethink the moral roots in order to fight populism, to combat populism. However, and this draws upon what Ralf was saying, his first question. I mean, I translate into philosophical terms. I mean, when you talk about liberalism after World War II, you're talking, for instance, about Jesaja Berlin and a reduction of freedom to negative freedom or negative liberty, understood as freedom from interference. So, and now if we combine it, as John Stuart Mill did, with a perfectionist moral theory, and then understood as the other part missing positive freedom, meaning freedom too. My question is, I mean, many self-proclaimed liberals will oppose and will say, but this is no longer liberal because you're prescribing somehow what's the good way or how I ought to live and so on, all these points. But I mean, if I understood you correctly, you will say, no, it's not just one form of a good life, but you agree with Rawls, at least in this respect, that we need a sort of pluralism. And so yes, we need to address these moral questions. We need to say, we need an answer to the question, how do we become better human beings instead of being human beings who just do what they happen to want? But there is room for pluralism. But still, the populist will say, well, you're prescribing, which is now very prominent in the debate on freedom of speech, for instance, on X. So how would you answer to this question? Yes, yes, okay.
Thanks a lot. We are collecting some questions, please.
Okay. Hello, Liane Bednarz. I'm a journalist drawing a line between conservatism and right-wing populism. I would like to, I would be happy about an answer how much you see the danger that right-wing populists are actually hijacking, to some extent, the very term liberalism, in the sense that they demand freedom for everything they want to say, even if it's full of hatred. And whenever they're criticized, they say, oh, you're attacking my liberal speech. And this has become quite a strong movement in Germany, where many people who, especially in the media, certain journalists who used to be conservative are now discovering their sort of like even lust, if you want to call it like that, and disruption. and just basically destroying liberal values because they think everything which is sort of like civil society is tending to a leftish liberalism. So we need to fight back, sort of. And my fear is really to see the liberal conservative center in a sort of eroding, where it is because the very term liberalism is being hijacked by those kind of people.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Hello, Markus Meckel. Short question. What about responsibility? Do I have the choice to be responsible or not?
So maybe two other questions here at the front. And then we come to a final round here.
Rupert Strachwitz from the Mecenate Foundation. I would underwrite everything you said in your introduction with one exception where I would challenge you. And that is when you mentioned solidarity as a feature of liberalism. And I'm not so sure that is true, because solidarity actually always implies that there is an opponent. Workers got together, adopted an attitude of solidarity against employers and whatever. And I think this would contradict what was mentioned earlier as the main feature of liberalism, which is a sort of general attitude of respect to anybody else's way of life, thinking, and so on. So I'm not sure whether solidarity actually is the right way to put it, and even less to put it above fraternity. I think respect or something like that would be the better term. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Eva Christoph.
I'm a member of the European Parliament, and the longer we are in this so-called new world where liberalism is hijacked, I agree a lot with Liane Bettnarz, and that has to do with Jan mentioned, the only one very sharp here, that we live in a so-called new global media society. And as public, as Habermas said 40 or 50 years ago, is an essential part, the way of the public is an essential part of lively democracy, I think there should have been much more sharper thinking about the so-called social media, which Biden in his goodbye speech yesterday called a neo-feudal oligarchic system and danger for democracy. And I find it very strange if journalists call it only new media and new public, but I think it's much more dangerous for democracy and liberalism. The other point is I want to agree a lot with Alan Kahan, and I'm surprised that maybe I can become now a liberal thinker. But I listen more and more as a theologian, what you are all saying about populism and democracy the last 10 years, and I must say, I see there is a lack of knowledge of theology. The Catholic Church is not the only church in the world, and especially in the moment of danger we are, it's not just only Alice Weidel, it's Islamist terrorists at the same time. Liberal democracy is in danger with. So I would like to have more thinking about hope, fearlessness, all old categories of religion and spirituality at least. And I think if our politicians are now speaking about Zuversicht, they have not enough depth of thinking and historical knowledge to do it. Thanks.
So, thanks a lot. Final round on the panel. We will have you as the last speaker, Ellen. So please feel free to pick up the questions and remarks which you find you most challenging.
Just 2 points. One is about social media, and there is always this dream that you can just get rid of it and then everything gets better. But I think we have to live in a reality where we cannot get rid of it anymore. I mean, we tried and we failed, and now we have to adapt to this new public sphere and try to win. And I think the debate about how to counter, illiberal thoughts on social media, to me, what we see on social media is a symptom of an underlying problem, and to try to fight social media, we've tried this for such a long time now, and in Europe we have laws that are trying to temper hate speech. It never really works. And now Mark Zuckerberg gave it up all at once, and I feel if we don't address the underlying cause, and for me this is the only solution would be to do exactly what I think you're talking about, is the value system that we have to offer should be a bit more liberal again, in a way that we move a bit out of our garden that we nurtured for such a long time and plant a few more trees that we still believe are part of the liberal forest, but we have neglected to nurture them, and that is discussions about the good life in the sense of what we mentioned, what is patriotism, how do we react to life and the sanctuary of life, and things that we thought we would not need to debate anymore, but I think we have to address our, not pathologies, but our shortcomings.
Kerstin, because I discovered that we have a very long lunch break, so I would like to raise a last question, personal question to you with your long experience in the US. Would you agree to the analysis that the main root cause of populism is cultural alienation, as Alan says, cultural alienation between the liberal elites and the everyones?
Yeah, we always divide it in the better educated and the less educated, or the wealthy and the not so wealthy. I think it is a bit more warped, this line of cultural divide, but the topics...
Anywheres and the somewheres.
But I think there is if you'd say culture or value system, I think they belong together, whether it is what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be and I come back to that because to me that is such a interesting and important topic, what it means to be a patriot, because that seems to be the hottest fire that people assemble around in the more populist defined world. And I feel this is something, and Rorty has tried to do that already, in the 90s, how to define patriotism in a more liberal way to take away some of the excitement and the heat that populists are using. And I think this is one of the major issues in the US and here too.
Karolina, among the other topics you want to pick up, also a question to you. Would you agree that populism is mainly a moral challenge to liberalism, what Alan says, or is it a result of the shortcomings of the governance system?
This is a great question. I think that populism is one of the reactions to how our epoch is difficult to digest, to how difficult it is to stand the galloping change. This is populism. Populism is also a reaction to the closing up of the liberal elites, It's very often a moral reaction, whilst seeing the deadlocks of liberal debate. Alan has mentioned that. Talking about abortion, I think every country has a list of subjects that meet certain deadlocks. Abortion is one of them. And it's a frustration connected with the fact that subjects are not treated seriously enough. And then it's also the political aspect of it, changing the collective frustration into populist politics that I call the populist content. I just wanted to make one more remark just for the end, because I was delighted to hear that my metaphor of the garden has been growing. It was planted here and it was growing during this panel. And I just wanted to share my own gardening experience of my very little garden. Listen, gardening is also giving life. And it's caring. It's loving. Extremely important features for a society. It's about emotions. And last but not least, listen, I told you today that I am from the generation of Solidarność. I am from the generation of the revolution. Do you remember the song? The children of the revolution. So gardening is also about joy. And I think this joy might be also mentioned as a part of liberal politics. Without joy, escaping from fear and hoping just seems too little.
Yeah, I think we all agree that there's not the one single answer to populism, but what do you think, should be the main answers? What are in your view, the major responses liberals should give to the populist challenge?
Look, I like the metaphor of gardening, so you convince me. But I'm not entirely convinced by the respect in all cases. Respect for misogyny, respect for anti-Semitism, respect for homophobia. Give me a break, eh? There are limits to this. And we are not only talking about the dialogue, we're talking about lawmaking, basically imposing certain ethical code on everybody. And this is what I have a problem with, because exactly liberalism for me is pluralism, that we are different, that the nation is not the most important and only identity, that we have other identities, and we have, that the culture, it cannot be form engineered by decree. And this is what I have problems with when populists come to power. Now, but I totally agree with you, Alan, that we've been, as liberals, arrogant. And it has something to do with ideology, which became an ideology of power. Because as it happened in the post-war period in Europe, center-left, center-right parties all shared liberal ideology, and they were in power. As you wrote in your book, this was ideology of resistance against those, and the kings who didn't want to consult the people, or the religious which was imposed on them. So it was ideology of those resisting those in power, and in Europe it has become ideology of power, and as it happened very often with those in power, then they try to justify all their shortcomings. One of the shortcomings they have done is that they have not adjusted democracy to the new world. It is not just social media, it is also turbo capitalism, you know, where economy is being, billions are being transferred in fractions of the second all over the globe, you know, and the economy which was 24, you know, /7 in constant mode. And we haven't found a way to do this. We had in Europe emergency government by decree since financial crisis, because democracy is about slowing down things, and we basically cannot slow down things because there is a pandemic, because there is financial crisis. So they make decisions on the run without, you know, parliaments are basically sidelined these days. Civic participation, forget. You know, so we have not adjusted democracy up, you know, to the new environment we live in. But here, and I finish, the road to, you know, as a liberal, I wouldn't try to construct new utopia. The liberal way of doing those things is by try and error. We have to encourage an environment in which we can experiment. And as you know, experiments fail sometimes. We have to accept that we fail sometimes, but we cannot just sit and wait for other people taking advantage of this. But in this movement of experimenting, you know, and here a lot can be done, you know. You know, e-democracy, only, you know, Cinque Stelle, a populist, tried to use it. Real multi-level governance, you know, just delegating decisions and resources to local and transnational units, doesn't really happen. The opposite happens. You know, empowering networks which benefited from digitalizations to contribute to public goods, we can be creative about this. But at the end of the day, if you don't want to fall in the populist maze, you indeed need to have values. And in this, I totally agree with this. But what I believe as a liberal, I try to apply my values to myself and eventually act by example and not to tell to everybody with a big finger, this is what you should do. Because exactly I understand that people have different situations, they come from different ways. But not, there are the limits of the tolerations of respect. Because the things as a liberal, I cannot accept. And whether it's a form or contents, I don't know. But there are limits to this. And we have to stand for this. Because if we justify gross violation of human rights on borders, depriving, you know, if we basically justified just totally illegal behaviors, either in national or international level, because, you know, this is politically convenient, then I think we cut the branch on which we are sitting. And sometimes you have to say, no, this is the limit of my respect or tolerance.
Thanks a lot. Helen.
Okay, I'm going to try to mostly respond to the questions that have been raised by the audience, since I've already been dialoguing somewhat with the members of the panel, but there'll be some cross-fertilization, to use another garden metaphor, I hope. So there's a thing sometimes called Popper's paradox, after the Austrian philosopher and historian of science, Karl Popper. And Popper said that if I, as a liberal, give unlimited freedom to the enemies of freedom, freedom will be destroyed. Somebody else once said that the poor will be with us always. This may not be true, but what is true is that the illiberal will be with us always. And that at no point in the history of liberalism have liberals ever really found a satisfactory solution to the problem of illiberalism. For some time, quite permissibly, liberals thought, look, Give it a couple more generations. Make everybody literate, send them to high school, make sure they often own their own homes, and illiberalism will disappear. We now know that is not true, and will likely never be true. Deal with it. We don't really have good strategies. Once upon a time, certain kinds of liberals, particularly in France and in Germany, but just as much in England and the United States, imagined that the embodiment of illiberalism was the Catholic Church, but in the long run, this was not a problem because Catholicism was going to disappear. No. And even if it did, we've had other examples of illiberal religion rising up in its place. So we need to develop strategies that recognize that illiberalism is there, will always be there, and must indeed be rejected. No, we do not have to have, as part of a liberal worldview, some sense of deep respect for racism, pedophilia, and various other illiberal forms of life. And this is, in fact, what a return to moral language will enable us to consistently say. Even Isaiah Berlin, in fact, when he was thinking a little bit harder about the subject and revising his famous essays on liberty, said, well, you know, I never meant to exclude positive freedom. I was just talking about the greater dangers of, you know, people who rejected negative freedom. But in fact, by a return to a language of values, which in fact has to be said, cannot be purely interior, because then otherwise nobody knows about it. You may be an admirable person, but if you do not explain why you are such an admirable person, what motivates you, you've left something important out, I think. Which is not to say that finger-wagging, which is what, of course, preachers and intellectuals are wont to do by nature, is the best way of doing things, but nevertheless, dialogue must be engaged on, not merely by example, but also in the public sphere, where indeed people have to engage. Look, I admit it, I do not have a Facebook account. I do not have an Instagram account, and maybe I ought to, but I don't. So I'm by no means necessarily a perfect example of what I'm preaching either, but this is the kind of debate in which I think we have to engage. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Mir geht es jetzt so am Ende dieser Diskussion wie sagen oft in nachdenklichen Gesprächen, dass mit jeder Antwort, die man gibt, neue Fragen aufgeworfen werden. Das gehört vielleicht auch zum Liberal Script. Ich fand noch mal diese letzte Bemerkung, dass diese Vorstellung, also Fukuyama, Ende der Geschichte, der Liberalismus hat ein für alle Mal gesiegt, dass das eine völlig unhistorische Idee ist. Ja, und es gehört zum Wesen der Moderne, dass sie die Antimoderne hervorbringt. Und des Liberalismus, dass er den Antiliberalismus immer wieder auch produziert. Und die Freisetzung von permanenter Veränderung, von ständigem Wandel, immer auch Gegenreaktionen hervorrufen, die versuchen, sich in die Vergangenheit zu flüchten oder eine stabile Ordnung zu errichten, an der nicht gerüttelt werden darf. Die Frage ist, wie wir damit umgehen, ohne diese Bedürfnisse nach Sicherheit, nach Stabilität und Kontinuität zu denunzieren. Sie sind ja legitim. Also für Liberale gibt es die Notwendigkeit, sich mit konservativen Bedürfnissen, wenn ich das so verkürzt nennen darf, auseinanderzusetzen und eine Antwort auf sie zu finden. Zum Beispiel Sicherheit im Wandel. ist eine zentrale Voraussetzung, um Akzeptanz für liberale Demokratien und für offene Gesellschaften zu erhalten. Und ich würde gerne auch im Verlauf des Tages weiter durchbuchstabieren, was es bedeutet und was es erfordert, eine Gesellschaft herbeizuführen ohne Furcht. Ja, welche Art von Vorkehrungen sind dafür nötig oder auch welche Art von Ermächtigungen für Menschen, damit sie in der Lage sind, ein Leben ohne Furcht zu finden, wenn es das überhaupt gibt. Wenn Furcht nicht auch eine anthropologische Konstante ist. Aber wir reden hier von politischer Furcht oder sozialer Furcht. Ja, und ich glaube, dass wir uns darüber nochmal neue Gedanken machen müssen, was sind die Voraussetzungen für ein Leben ohne Furcht. Vielen Dank für diese Diskussion.